Imagine living on a remote farm, surrounded by forest, miles away from help. Then one day, you notice footprints in the snow leading toward your house, but none leading away. At night, you hear footsteps above your bedroom. Strange sounds echo from the attic, and someone may already be inside the house. Just days later, 6 people would be brutally murdered on this isolated farm in Bavaria, Germany. And more than 100 years later, nobody knows who did it. This is the terrifying true story of the Hinterkaifeck murders, one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in history. The isolated farmhouse. The Hinterkaifeck farm stood alone near the small Bavarian town of Grubern. The property belonged to Andreas Gruber and his family. Neighbors described Andreas as harsh, controlling, and feared by many nearby. Living on the farm were his wife, Cecilia, their widowed daughter, Victoria, Victoria's 2 children, and a newly hired maid. The farm itself appeared ordinary, but according to later reports, something strange had already begun. The footprints in the snow days before the murders, Andreas noticed footprints emerging from the forest. They led directly toward the farmhouse. But there was something deeply unsettling about them. There were no footprints leading back. Whoever came to the farm had apparently never left. Then came the noises. Footsteps from the attic late at night. Unexplained sounds above the ceiling. And, according to reports, Andreas even found a newspaper on the property that nobody recognized. Someone may have been watching the family, possibly living inside the farm itself. The maid, who was too frightened to stay the family's previous maid, reportedly became terrified of the property. She claimed the farm was haunted. Eventually, she quit and left. Only days later, a new maid arrived at Hinterkaifeck. It was her very first day on the farm. She had no idea. She was walking into one of the most horrifying murder scenes in modern history. The night of the murders. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, something happened inside the barn. Investigators later believed members of the family were lured there one by one, silently, one after another. Each victim was killed with a mattock, a brutal farming tool similar to a pickaxe. The attacks were violent, personal, and horrifyingly close. The maid and the youngest child were later found inside the house. No gunshots were heard. No neighbors reported screams. Only silence. The killer stayed behind, but the most terrifying part of the story came after the murders. Days passed before anyone checked the property. Yet neighbors noticed something strange. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Animals were being fed. Someone appeared to be moving around the farm. When investigators finally entered the property, they discovered all 6 bodies, and evidence suggested the killer may have remained there for several days after the murders, sleeping, eating, living among the dead. A crime scene destroyed by curiosity. The investigation quickly descended into chaos. Before police could properly secure the scene, neighbors and visitors walked through the farmhouse. Critical evidence was contaminated. Possible footprints were destroyed. Objects were moved, and in 1922, forensic science was extremely limited. Police questioned numerous suspects over the years. Neighbors, former workers, even people connected personally to the family. But no definitive evidence ever identified the killer. Why modern forensics still can't solve it. Decades later, modern investigators revisited the case using advanced forensic analysis. Old photographs were re-examined. Witness statements were analyzed. Timelines were reconstructed. But there was one major problem. Most physical evidence no longer existed. No preserved DNA, no reliable fingerprints, no confirmed murder weapon tied to a suspect. And because the original crime scene had been contaminated, modern science could only go so far. The mystery survived. The horror that never left. Eventually, the Hinterkaifeck farmhouse was demolished. But the story never disappeared, because the case contains something more disturbing than violence. It contains uncertainty, the possibility that someone watched the family before the murders, the possibility that the killer hid nearby, and the terrifying idea that after the killings were over, someone stayed behind in the silence of that farmhouse, completely unnoticed. More than a century has passed since the Hinterkaifeck murders, yet the farmhouse horror remains unsolved. No confession, no definitive suspect, no final answer,